So one thing that you said, which is interesting, which might not be exactly on topic, but maybe you can find a way to
Oh, of
get
course,
it
of
back
course.
on. But what you were saying about how Thomas his idea of like why God created had to do with like the good naturally sort of I don't even know the right words for this, but like tending towards like sharing or whatever.
Yeah.
And this is basically what Bulgakov says as well. And you'll find critiques of Bulgakov on this point from I think people like Florovsky, and maybe Staniloy, but more like implicitly in his Trinitarian theology that actually um that idea of like the sharing aspect of the essence
Mhm.
that's already completed in God himself because God is Trinity. So the Father already like so actually Florensky says this as well, which is interesting because obviously Bulgakov was really influenced by Florensky, but like Florensky talks about how the three, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they complete that um requirement of gift giving that is obviously a requirement of the good because the good is communion in our
Mhm.
theology. So what it I don't know, do you have any personal takes on like
Yeah.
whether this compromises his view of the Trinity or like what does Aquinas actually say about this in relation to the Trinity, like how the essence relates to the persons in this context?
So I mean, I think there's like, so people have often remarked, right, that that Aquinas begins with De Deo Uno, right, the one God.
Hmm.
So, and that is sort of more established through natural theology. And then we
Right.
have the Trinity, and I don't want to say it comes in as a postscript, but Trinity is revealed through faith, and then we kind of have to explicate our Trinitarian doctrine, but that there is a beginning with the one God. And when you mentioned the whole, when the your take on the good needing to spread itself, but there's this sort of like that's covered, like we have that covered by the Trinity. What's really interesting is where that axiom comes from is Neoplatonism. And so, like in Plotinus, the idea that you have like the one and then the intellect and then the world soul. Um, I remember I was talking to one of my professors one time and I was really confused. I said, I get how we get from the one to the intellect, that somehow it needs to like express itself and the one is completely inexpressible. And so it needs to almost, behold itself. But why do we get the world soul and then just fall into creation and all this stuff? And he said, well, it's because it's this Neoplatonic axiom that the good always has to spread itself. And that's where Thomas is getting that from. But it's not, but the Trinity and the one God are sort of considered separately conceptually.
Hmm.
There's not really a linking that's going on, is what my take would be on that.
Okay, so also how would this relate to like what you were saying about how the divine ideas are sort of like I'm not familiar with like the language like Thomistic scholars would use, but almost like virtual like something about like the divine essence knowing itself in its perfection, right? How would how would you what's your personal take on that as well? Because that also seems to be, at least in contrast, and maybe we can like dovetail this into Maximus, contrasting it with Maximus, because for Maximus, obviously, the divine ideas are logi, and the logi are not identical to the divine essence. But it seems like Aquinas wants to say something else there. So could you maybe like parse out the difference there and where Maximus and his doctrine of the Logi, which are his divine ideas, where they differ with Thomas?
Mhm. Yeah. So I guess one way of thinking of that sort of like virtually contained, um, the way that Thomas kind of explicates it is thinking of like ideas in our mind. And the example he uses is like a house in the mind of a builder. And basically, in the Thomistic idea of intellect, there's this sort of correspondence between being and intellect, right?
Mhm.
So, things that are material. So all being that is immaterial and not limited by matter is intellectual, right? Because things
Mhm.
that are limited by matter can't behold other forms, right? So
Right.
this goes back to the sort of Aristotelian idea that the intellect is in some sense all things.
Mm.
That when a form is transported from your corporeal senses into your intellect, there's first like an impact, you might say, where there's a correspondence or meeting of the form of that being and form in your mind, right? A form is kind of actualized in your mind, but it's sort of a correspondence. It's not yet an idea. And then there's a second level where you sort of take that correspondence and begin to create a concept out of it. And in being able to behold that concept, you're able to grasp all the ways, all its interrelations, and all its aspects, sort of virtually within that concept. And that's kind of the model of what God is doing here, is that he's really just understanding all aspects of himself and the fullness and depth of his own nature. And I guess really the contrast with Maximus here is and then he's understanding created things as particulars organized towards moving towards the end of showing forth his own glory, eventually in the beatific vision. So there is a similarity here with Maximus, is that Maximus does say very explicitly, he refers to the logoi as wills or
Mm-hmm.
determinations.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is similar to that secondary use of the ideas in Aquinas as regards the actual creation. But I think the big difference though is that the logoi are considered in like a formal unity with each other with all of creation, where they all come together to become one
Yeah.
logos. And that's something that you don't see in Aquinas, and you really can't see in Aquinas for some reasons we'll probably get into.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, Maximus will use words like saying all of creation is one man,
Mm-hmm.
and he'll talk about the goal of Christian contemplation eventually being the eroding of differences and eventually the understanding of creation as one thing. And of when you read his description of paradise or what the last day will be, he says in paradise, if Adam and Eve had not fallen, he said like there would be no place, right? There's a logoi of space, which is very interesting. It really gets into like what you were talking with Dr. Bradshaw
Mm-hmm.
a few weeks ago, where it's like there's a form of time, there's a logoi of time, but yet at the end we'll still be participating in it, but eternally.
Yeah.
And there's something similar where Maximus says like space is a logoi. It's part of the predeterminations of creation.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, in the eschaton or in paradise, if Adam and Eve had not sinned, there would either be no space, or Adam and Eve would be all places at once. All
Yeah.
creation would sort of be this one thing. And I think that's the critical difference, is that the logoi in Maximus are like inherently providential and they're
Mm-hmm.
inherently unified.
Right.
And that's the two differences that I point to.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I think that's crucial because